No, we won't keep No, we won't be here that long.
Okay.
I promise you. You get a little bit of a break.
You want me to start on 1 and 3?
Yeah. And Adrienne, you got my hangout?
Yes, it's on right now.
We're live.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, everybody, for stepping up and joining us. Maybe it's Periscope, maybe it's Facebook, maybe it's YouTube. I'm Adrienne Arsenault, one of the 37 hosts of the National. No, sorry, there are only 4 of us. But we are having what we're calling a national conversation, and we're going to have a lot of them in the next little while. But this one's really important. Joining me is Avvy. Avvy works at the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic.
Okay. Yep.
You deal every single day with people in need. Raj Sharma, thank you for joining us. Raj used to work at the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, now an immigration lawyer in Calgary. So you guys are on the front line of this. And what is this? This is the big question. We are in an era now where people are on the move on this planet in extraordinary ways. There are all sorts of pressures that are pushing people to leave. Obviously, you have the crisis, the 7-year conflict in Syria, pushing millions of people out. We're seeing a different type of conflict in Latin and South America. Venezuelans are leaving their country at a staggering rate, not because of war, but because of economic desperation. And a lot of these people are going wherever they can, and some are coming to Canada. And that's, we've seen across Canada's border the last little while, those pictures, I know you've all seen them, of people trudging through the snow and being greeted by our CMP officers. And so there have been lots of questions. What's irregular? What's legal? What's illegal? What's a migrant versus a refugee? Who's getting what? A lot of this language is loaded and is being used for political means by people on all ends of the spectrum. And we thought, you know what? Let's just cut to the bone here and figure out where the truth is in all this. So if we can just start with this loaded language, can you help us to understand migrant, refugee, asylum seeker? Help us with the terms. What means what?
I could start.
Sure.
I guess just from my perspective, migrant usually just refer to sort of like a number of people who are on the move from one country to the next. When we talk about migrant in Canada, very often is in the context of the migrant workers or people who are on temporary foreign workers permit. So they tend not to have a permanent status in Canada. They're here on some kind of a status to, as you said, to find a better life for themselves and their kids. When I think of refugees, I think of people who are fleeing country of origin because of something that is happening to them, either because they're facing persecution or risk of torture, like something very serious that affects their lives and liberty, and they have no choice but to leave that country to go to places that are perceived to be safer, countries like Canada. And asylum seekers or refugee claimants will be people who are in that process to establish they are refugee in the third country.
Okay, so when we talk about the act, Raj, of coming across the border, we get questions all the time, and please feel free to send as many questions as you want. We're here to try to answer them. What's an irregular border crossing? What's an illegal border crossing? What is, sometimes you hear people saying normal border crossing. Help us with those terms if you can.
Well, I think at a certain point, terms become unhelpful. I think that Tristan Hopper of the National Post discussed this. He canvassed a number of stakeholders on this topic as well. So the term illegal border crosser or irregular border crosser probably reveals a little bit about your own worldview.
You mean when you utter that term, it exposes where your biases are?
These are loaded terms, and I think that the terms are actually unhelpful. So when we look at, for example, a refugee claimant, either you are or you aren't. A refugee claimant can be made at the port of entry, it can be made inside Canada. These border crossers that have come, 30,000 now in the last 18 months or so, are refugee claimants. And Canada has an obligation under the Charter and international obligations to give refugee claimants a hearing to determine whether they are individuals that are persecuted, that are in need of protection. And so refugee is the relevant term of art. And I would I want to move away from their mode of arrival, whether they arrive at a port of entry or whether they cross not at a port of entry.
But I mean, I appreciate that you want to move away from it, but I think part of what happens is people see the image of someone crossing into Canada not at a regulated border crossing, and it feels illegal to them.
Correct, and you're right. It's perception, and that is a misperception. So when we have a refugee claimant, and we're signatory to the 1957 Convention on Refugees, refugees don't tend to show up with visas and other paraphernalia that other immigrants might have, and so that's recognized. We have individuals that are desperate, and we know that they're desperate, and we know that they're not going to do things the sort of quote-unquote what an economic migrant might do. And so we allow certain individuals to make a claim at the port of entry, and if you make a claim after crossing the border, not at a port of entry, you can make an inland refugee claim. Now,
So what does that mean? So if you have a family from Nigeria, for example, who's crossing in the snow from Roxham into Quebec, and is greeted by an RCMP officer. So the act of crossing is illegal, but it's not illegal once they've said, I want to make a claim?
well, I mean, the term itself illegal, it's something akin, it's not quite a criminal act, because while the contravention, i.e. crossing a border, does break technically a law, the law itself is stayed, i.e. the consequences is stayed until the refugee claim is adjudicated. So there's a provision, okay, you are supposed to present yourself at a port of entry, and if you don't, you're breaking X law.
Right.
But if you make a refugee claim, X law doesn't apply to you. So even that term illegal, to me, is nebulous. It's gray. I mean, how can it be strictly illegal when there's another act that moves to prevent the operation of that act?
Right, I see. So someone comes across contravening technically the law, but as soon as that person presents him or herself and makes the claim, then the other act balances it out.
There is nuance here, and so I know everyone wants these sort of black and white answers that, oh, you cross the border irregularly or not at a port of entry, you're committing an illegal act, and that's not quite true. So for example, let's say you've been deported in the past. You cannot re-enter Canada without authorization.
Okay.
Crossing the border would be an illegal act. If you've come into Canada irregularly and you make a refugee claim and you're eligible to make a refugee claim, that provision is stayed. There is no consequences for doing what you've done until the refugee claim is decided.
Okay,
And
very
I think,
helpful.
and I think
We have, we're starting to get some questions in already. This one from YouTube, and Avvy, you can help us
Sure.
with this. What rights do these migrants have once they're on Canadian territory?
Okay,
it's a big question.
we're going back to migrants.
Right.
So I guess I assume that we're actually still talking about refugees and refugee claimants, and we're talking about people who are crossing the border from the States into Quebec and other parts of Canada to make refugee claims. So, and then I think as Raj has mentioned, once they are here, they have the right to make a claim for protection in Canada, and that's partly because Canada has signed on to the Convention for the Rights of Refugees. We have within our law the opportunity for these claimants to make that claim. They can stay here until their claim is being determined. And Raj used to be on the Immigration and Refugee Board. That's the body that will determine whether or not someone is in fact a refugee. And during that time, they can apply for work permit, work in Canada, and depends on which provinces they live, they may be able to access some provincial benefits, but in general, refugee claimants have very little access to benefits that we Canadians, people who are permanent residents or citizens will have access to. So their rights are more prescribed, I would say. But we have an obligation under the international law and under our charter and under the immigration law to adjudicate their claim.
One of the questions you hear quite often from people, and again, this may be a matter of simply a misperception, people not understanding how it works, but that with the people who are crossing the border in that fashion that you describe, is the act of sort of offering them what Canada's obliged to offer under law mean that they jump a queue? Mean that somebody else doesn't get something they're entitled to? Someone who came in through an airport?
There isn't really a queue for people who are kind of coming into our border to make a refugee claim. There's a huge queue kind of in the backlog system right now for the claims to be processed, because the government, especially the previous government, hasn't really put in the resources to process the claim. But it's not like Canada is saying, oh, we would only accept that many immigrants if we take that many refugees. I don't think any of the government has said that.
But there are two streams, right?
They're completely different, but also, well, the government may decide from time to time to say, we're going to accept how many government-sponsored refugees. So for instance, Trudeau said, this year I'm going to take 25,000 refugees from Syria. So they're directly sponsored by the government, or they are sort of sponsored through private sponsorship holders who have agreement with the government. So they came in as convention refugees. But the claimants, they come in, they file a claim, there isn't really a queue for them, and they're not taking away the seats for anybody else.
Okay, it's confusing, Raj.
That term, again, is a problematic term. I don't like the term queue at all.
Right.
And if someone believes that inland refugee claimants are jumping a queue, I don't think there's anything that I can say to convince that person otherwise. Because again, that concept is a worldview. And the concept of a queue is very important to Canadians, because Canadians, I mean, we've been taught since elementary school not to budge, not to stay in line. And so this concept of individuals crossing the border of their own volition, deeply held belief, but logically, there is no queue. It's not really a queue. It's kind of a queue. There is no queue. There is no queue for inland refugee claimants. You come and you make a refugee claim, whether it's at a port of entry like an airport, or an inland office, or a land port of entry crossing from the U.S.
But if we can presume for a moment that the question is being asked in all innocence, without a sense of bias, that someone is genuinely asking, if someone comes in this way and is dealt with this way, is someone else not being helped? Is something not happening because there is an influx from a different
We can certainly talk about the cost that refugee claimants or inland refugee claimants may impose on municipal or provincial or federal resources. They are entitled, for example, to a certain degree of health care. They are entitled to provincial social assistance, for example. In terms of a queue, they're going to make a refugee claim. Their claim is going to be determined by the Immigration Refugee Board, by the Refugee Protection Division of the IRB. The government-sponsored refugees is a completely different stream, if you will, and that is unaffected. That processing is unaffected by these individuals that are crossing the border into Canada. We can certainly talk about the case that the more claimants that come across the border, the greater the incentive for other individuals to come in, because while their claims are adjudicated, and there's a 55,000 backlog, that term I'll accept.
That's real.
That's real. So it'll take years to get a hearing. During those years, they're going to have a work permit. They're going to set down roots here, and then it remains to be seen how removal is then going to occur. So these are all legitimate questions that can be asked, but I take issue with the premise of certain terms because it leads us into these traps that then don't allow light.
Right.
But also, I think it's important to remember that people who are crossing the border now are not the first ever refugee claimants who come in Canada through that way. Every day, there are people who are coming in, from my experience working with mostly refugee claimants from China, they also have done that before. So because if they can't take a direct flight from China to Canada, sometimes they'll fly to somewhere in the States, and then they will somehow cross the border, just like the ones who are doing that right now because of the Safe Third Country Agreement that Canada has signed with the U.S. So that makes it impossible for them to just show up at the border and make a claim. So we created that situation ourselves by signing an agreement with the United States that would not allow people who come in directly through the United States to make a claim here. And that's why they have to cross the border in this irregular way.
Okay, we have a question here from Sandra Sharat, who's asking on Facebook, are these asylum seekers coming across the border documented? Do we have real numbers on what we need to deal with, was how Sandra phrase that. Raj?
We have about, so the surge is unprecedented. So the last time we had numbers of this magnitude, it was right after 2001, and that's when myself and my law partner were refugee protection officers at the IRB. So at that time, about 20,000. So this surge is unprecedented, about 30,000 in the last 18 months or so. We do have numbers, we don't have a lot of numbers. The IRB has just released some statistics, so we're looking at approximately 30,000. We've got a 55,000 backlog. Our IRB system can handle about 20,000 per year. The top countries so far, Nigeria, out of the 30,000, it's 10,000, a third is from Nigeria, followed by about 7,000 or 8,000 is from Haiti, and then the numbers drop off significantly after that. So what we need to understand is that this may well be either the tip of the iceberg or the calm before the storm. We've got 30,000, and right now this is a challenge, but this is not a crisis, and the IRB system is not collapsing, but Donald Trump has canceled TPS status of El Salvadorans, Nicaraguans, Nepalese, Somalian, Sudanese. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of individuals in the U.S. with precarious status. Now, they're between a rock and a hard place, so what are their choices? They're going to stick around and deal with ICE and this hardline Trumpian philosophy. They're going to go back to war-ravaged or violent or corrupt countries, or they might start looking up north to Canada. So this may be the calm before the storm. And we've survived so long, or Canada's been able to maintain its immigration systems, refugee determination systems, because we had the U.S. to the south, this sort of welcoming, benign, wealthy neighbor with that welcoming philosophy was inscribed on their Statue of Liberty. And we were like that remora on that great white shark and just picking off what the great white shark wouldn't take. And so we've been very, very lucky to pick and choose our own immigrants and been able to look down our noses at the U.S. And now all of a sudden that attitude, that philosophy has changed. So this surge is not going to abate until that Trumpian philosophy is going to abate.
Interesting. Okay, Sandy Chase asked the question. Sandy, you asked, we've heard so many versions of this question, why do we need to financially support them before they get permanent residency? I'm not clear if that's a question about ethics or law, but that's the question.
I think it's in part because of our international obligation, but I think it's also wrong to assume that we are financially support them all the way until they get the permanent resident status. As we have both mentioned earlier, once you make the claim, you can apply for work permit, and in fact, many of our clients do apply for work permit because they don't want to be on social assistance. They don't want to rely on government support. They do want to find a job. However, sometimes they do have difficulties finding jobs because, who are they? Refugee status with a work permit. There are a lot of employers out there who would not hire them. And those who do tend to see this as an opportunity to exploit. So we have clients who, if an employer who will pay you according to your status, if you're a permanent resident, you get minimum wage. If you're a refugee with a work permit, you get less than minimum wage. So they are very subject to exploitation out there. But by and large, I would say, in my experience, a lot of the refugee claimants, even after, they may spend the first few months on social assistance, but as soon as they get a job, they get off social assistance so that they can get on with their life.
So, but just to go back to Sandy's question, there is why?
Because
Why does Canada need to do that?
Because we do have that international obligation. Yeah.
I would characterize it in the sense of that they have legal status in Canada. They're entitled to access provincial benefits. So there's citizens of Canada, there's permanent residents of Canada, and there's those individuals with legal status in Canada, work permit holders and students, for example, and refugees. And so with that status and their residency, they are entitled to access provincial benefits, and they're entitled to interim federal health care as well.
Yeah, except the provinces sometimes, including Ontario, their social assistance legislation may not always provide for anyone with precarious status. So I don't know about other provinces, but certainly that's one of the issues that often the people without status face.
There is a cost to refugee refugee claimants. Now, the previous government, when Jason Kenney, the then Minister of Immigration, announced these refugee reforms, they calculated the cost per claim at $50,000. Now, we don't have the numbers from this government in terms of costs, because there are costs. There's going to be funding for legal aid is desperately needed. These individuals may require psychological or other advanced sort of medical intervention, for example, housing, and of course social assistance until they get on their feet, until they get that work permit. So there are costs associated with refugee claims, and it is going to be an issue for many Canadians, and it's an understandable one.
Well, it's certainly an issue in the questions that we're already receiving, again from Irish Quinn on Facebook, and I can see from the way the question's written that there's some anger here. Correct me if I'm wrong, Irish. How about we take care of all the citizens we already have who are in need before anyone else gets it? How many times have you heard that question?
Right, I do hear that a lot, but I don't really see it as an either or. There are many benefits that Canadian citizens have that refugee claimants don't have access to. It's not like, because we're giving it to refugee claimants and we're denying that benefits to citizens. Certainly, you can always question why we're not spending more money on improving health care for citizens or permanent residents. We can beef up our affordable housing program, which the government has really not lived up to, and we now have a national housing strategy. We have to have a national poverty reduction strategy to deal with poverty among all Canadians. So all of that are legitimate concerns, but it's not that the government has chosen to provide those services to refugees, and because of that, we have not dealt with our own people. That's not the reason at all. The reason is, I think successive government has simply failed to deal with some of the day-to-day needs of Canadians, period. And now refugees become an easy scapegoat for ourselves.
Okay. You look like you're thinking hard there. I can almost see steam coming out of your ears.
Well, I think that is a common sentiment, but I think when you look at this situation, this is, Adrienne, I think, an intractable problem. There's no easy solution. They're entitled by law to come into Canada and make a refugee claim.
Right.
By virtue of that status, they're entitled to accessing certain benefits and our social support systems here. There is no, if anyone thinks that we're going to build an 8,000-kilometer long fence and patrol it, if anyone thinks that somehow we're going to repeal the STC, the Safe Third Country Agreement, without the Americans on board, if anyone thinks that we can simply willy-nilly pick them up and drop them off on the other side of the U.S. border and wash our hands of it, then probably, this is pie-in-the-sky thinking, right? And so let's just deal with there's certain consequences that are going to flow from this, and it's unavoidable. But I do understand the sentiment behind that question.
A practical question here from Donald Custerhow from YouTube. How long do these claims on average take to be filed and processed? You talked about a backlog, and I'm watching the calendar days flip by.
This is like trying to catch a falling knife. This is impossible. If anyone were to say, well, it's going to take 2 years right now, well, you've got a system that can handle 20,000 refugee claims or finalize them per year, and you're getting X number over and above that. So now you've got a backlog. So we've got 55,000 backlogs. So let's say refugee claims, everyone stops making a refugee claim today. It would take 2 years plus just to clear this backlog. So right now, anyone that says it's 2 years plus, I would probably say, and again, this is like a snowball rolling down a hill. More people make a refugee claim, the longer it takes to get a refugee hearing, the more their relatives and friends in the U.S. see that this is a viable option. More people cross the border. What if it takes 5 years? What if it takes 10 years to get a hearing done? And so our system is simply not designed to handle these types of numbers. So at a certain point, we may have to deal with grappling with an amnesty. We may have to grant amnesty to large numbers because our system was simply not designed for this surge. Our system was designed because we had Jupiter to our south who is sucking in with its massive gravitational pull this issue. And now we don't have that anymore.
Jupiter being the United States. Right. So, but why is there not a discussion about beefing up the IRB system, beefing up a means of processing?
Well, this current government has recently made a lot more appointments to the Avvy system, and I think that they're still trying to deal with the backlog. But I think, as Raj suggests, many groups have been calling on the government to think about having a regularization process, because let's say if you have claimants from certain country with very clear track records of human rights violations, and if, in particular, for instance, sometimes it's if you're a LGBTQ member or if you're a woman, at risk, maybe you shouldn't have to wait for 5 years before you get your refugee status. And we actually have been recently talking to some of the senators and to talk about the possibility of having that program so that you kind of clear out some of the backlog as soon as possible.
Okay, here's again, and it's interesting, Deb Somfay, you asked this question, and it's something we were talking about earlier, but it absolutely bears worth repeating. Refugee versus asylum seeker, and I know you don't like the terms, but people genuinely want to understand and want to make sure they're using. What is the difference between the two?
Functionally, there's no difference between the two. An asylum seeker is a refugee. A refugee is a term of art. A refugee is defined under Section 96 and 97 of the Immigration Refugee Protection Act. It is an individual that's outside of his or her country that fears persecution by reason of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. There's another definition as well, a person that's in need of protection. But the act of asylum could result in the status of refugee, or a refugee claim itself as an asylum claim. Those terms are basically interchangeable. In the US, they tend to use the word asylum more. In Canada, we tend to use the word refugee more.
Okay, fair enough. So just a note about online, what's happening online here. There are lots of people, we see you, lots of people on Facebook having conversations with each other about this discussion. And I know sometimes when you're talking about this subject, people start poking at each other. It pushes all sorts of buttons. So clearly this is a discussion Canadians are having. Why is it so divisive? Why does this one have people going to an angry place so quickly?
I think Canadians can be very generous if they choose to. And historically, for instance, we've accepted tens of thousands of Indo-Chinese refugees, the boat people, during the Civil War in Vietnam. Nobody blinked. We just take in 40 or 50,000 of them all at once. But right now,
a source of huge pride for Canada.
Yeah, exactly. We got a medal for that. But now I think maybe it's the political climate. Having Trump as president doesn't help because it does change the narrative, it does change the rhetoric, and it also doesn't help. Our own politicians are using refugees as a wedge issue, and I see that from time to time. This is not just happening today. And to blame them for, a housing crisis in Toronto, for instance. We've been talking about housing crisis in Toronto for the last 15 years. It has nothing to do with refugees, but, they get blamed. I think media have a role to play as well. Certainly CBC's decision to not use the word illegal, and now I see you using the word irregular, it helps because it helps people reframe or rethink the issue. So I think we all have an obligation to really learn about the issue so that we can have an informed discussion and informed opinion about this.
The night President Trump was elected, if I may, I was in Washington at the time, and I was outside the White House, and a very drunk man in a Make America Great hat came up and was a little pushy with us, and he sort of put his finger in my face and said, "You Canadians are so smug. And you're so smug because you don't have to deal with what we have to deal with. Nobody's banging on your door, just you wait." And then he sort of tootled off. Wise drunken words. Interesting drunken words. And I've thought about him a lot because I do think a lot of Canadians were very detached from the matter of people scrambling to get in out of desperation to the country because it hasn't been a Canadian reality all that much.
This has always been a divisive issue. Look back to Shakespeare's Sir Thomas More, that speech about Protestants in England. I mean, if you look at it, the Arab Spring, ISIS, Syria, the migrant flows out of Syria caused the rise of far-right anti-immigrant political parties in Europe. Germany took in 1 million. If you look at Brexit wasn't about bureaucrats in Brussels. Brexit was about this conception of hordes of brown people flooding into the UK and the loss of control, sovereignty. Now, Brexit was about, okay, we're expecting 60,000 Polish workers in, and they got 600,000. And the Polish workers drove down the wages of native Britishers at the lower wage levels. We've never had that problem in Canada because we selected highly skilled immigrants. And so when we select highly skilled immigrants, they're not competing against the lower education or lower wage Canadians or native-born population. Because we were able to select our immigrants, we've never had this feeling, this nativist sentiment. Nativist sentiment is created when you lose control over, or perceived lack of control over individuals. So when we choose individuals, we're welcoming, we're multicultural, and it works. When immigrants or migrants or asylum seekers choose us, that strikes a chord, this nativist chord.
But don't forget, Canada turned away Jewish refugees during the Second World War, and according to one of the immigration officers, one is too many when it comes to Jews, right? So it's not true that we have not dealt with this before, but in fact, in much part of our history, we have turned them away. And, we started to receive them in the 70s. I don't know for whatever reasons we found our values or whatnot.
I think it started with Chile.
Yeah.
Actually, and a leak of a whistleblower, a Canadian who found a document, a communique from the embassy, and actually exposed to, I think, the NDP and then the media, look how desperate these people are, and the door's open.
Yeah, and I would want to appeal to Canadians, like, even if you have come as immigrants. For instance, I came as an immigrant myself. My parents were refugees, right? They were in China, and because of the all kinds of problems in China, the Japanese occupation and all that kind of reason, they left China as refugees, right? And then eventually they make their way to Canada, and I think that kind of story is true for many Canadians. So even you yourself may not have come as a refugee. You may have picked Canada as an immigrant. I'm sure somewhere in the history of your family, they must have had to flee because of unrest or other, sort of situations in their home country. So think about how your ancestors would feel if they're here today and we turn them away because,
Right. And we have a question here that comes with, and this will be our last one, I think, with a few exclamation marks, from Tammy Peters on Facebook. Can you talk about the Safe Third Country Agreement? Are they not allowed to make refugee claim once they're already in the States? And why can't they go back to the United States? Because the United States is a safe country. There's a lot in there, but again, can we get a bare bones explanation of the Safe Third Country Agreement?
I'll do my best. After 2001, we approached the U.S. and we requested the Safe Third Country Agreement. We felt that individuals would cross into Canada to make a refugee claim, and so the Safe Third Country Agreement is premised. The premise of the Safe Third Country Agreement is that a refugee adjudication system between Canada and the U.S. are about equal or analogous. That is going to be tested in the courts very shortly. So the Safe Third Country Agreement indicates that, well, if you're in the U.S. or wherever you land first, let's say you land in Canada first, and you got to make a refugee claim in Canada. If you land in the U.S., you got to make a refugee claim in the U.S. They don't want forum shopping, so you can't go to a port of entry and make a refugee claim. Now, remember, what did we do before the STC? People in the past, in the U.S., they would go up to a port of entry and they would make a refugee claim at the port of entry. So we survived without the STC. And obviously, we have the STC now. Now, the STC has a number of exemptions. So let's say you're in the U.S., you go up to the port of entry, they're going to say, no, you can't enter Canada. You can't make a refugee claim here unless you've got some relatives, unless you're an unaccompanied minor. There are some exemptions. So what do people do? They'll go around that port of entry. And so the Safe Third Country Agreement does not apply to in-Canada refugee claims. So let's say you go 10 feet away from a regular port of entry and you get apprehended there. Well, after you cross the border, well, then that's an in-Canada refugee claim. and it doesn't apply to you.
Okay.
Now, the Conservatives have floated a proposal to extend the STC across that entire border, so it doesn't matter. Now you're going to have people that are going to cross illegally. They're going to remain underground. I mean, ironically, if you want an orderly immigration system, you're going to want these individuals to make that claim so that we can check out them, do security checks, vet them, and then process their claims. So if you actually want an orderly immigration system, you're going to actually encourage them to do what they're doing, the vast majority being apprehended, for example, in Lacal or in Ontario. So the STC is there. It remains to be seen whether the STC will survive court challenge, whether the U.S. remains a safe country with the detention of children, with the separation of families. That's going to be up in the air. So the STC is not some panacea. The STC is not some sort of cure-all that somehow, oh, because of the STC, they can't make this claim. The STC is exactly why they're crossing irregularly, because it prevents them from making a claim at a recognized port of entry.
Okay, last question. It's come from a few people, it looks like. Brianne May is, for example, one of the people who asked it. All right, so what's your answer? What's your solution?
Well, I think there is not one single solution. I mean, in an ideal world, we should try to get at the root cause as to why refugees are created in the first place. I mean, that takes miracle probably,
So
right?
help people to stay in their countries?
Exactly.
To help those countries to be the sort of place
Yeah, to
where people
rebuild.
want to stay?
Yeah, right. To inject human rights systems into countries like China. This is another source of refugees, and to have a rule of law system in these countries, to get rid of corruption. That will be the ideal. But short of that, I think we do have an obligation, and I think we just have to find a way that makes the most sense to process the claimants as they arrive. And I personally think that we should get rid of the Safe Third Country Agreement. Either way they're coming in, at least if they come in through the border, we will not have media report about people crossing the border illegally. They will just be processed just like everybody else.
Well, I want human rights and respect for human rights and equality and the rule of law in these source countries too, but I would also like to believe in unicorns and pixie dust. The reality is that if we could hope and pray, let's say, that the U.S. refugee adjudication system becomes analogous or truly the same as ours. And if that occurs, then people will not have an incentive to come to Canada. They'll say, well, the U.S. system is just as generous as Canada's system, so let's just make the claim here. They're coming here because there's a perception that the Canadian refugee adjudication system is more generous than the U.S. one, and that perception is correct.
Maybe we should do what the Russians do and try to interfere in their election.
Okay.
So,
Crazy.
so that's one possibility where the refugee systems align and the incentive is removed. That's one possibility. In reality, talk to me in a couple of years or sooner. The surge in irregular border crossings will subside as soon as Trumpism subsides in the U.S.
That's a whole separate discussion for another day. Listen, thank you very much for your questions. You've been very patient, very inquisitive. This is a conversation we're going to have to keep having. So we will be joined tonight, the pair of you will join us, as well as Jean-Nicolas Bose, who is the UNHCR's representative in Canada. So we're going to try to tackle more of these questions. We've had some from all across the country, and we will roll up our sleeves and we'll deal with this national conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Your hands are still cold.
I know.
Okay. All right.
Everyone can still carry.
All right, so that'll be on the National tonight at 9, 10, 11, 12, 1 Eastern. And I have a feeling that there'll be more questions online that we'll try to answer.